Wintrier weather to the northern, central, and eastern states than we've seen so far this season is coming. There's still a lot of uncertainty about how much wintrier, but we are now beginning to see better defined signs of changes to the overall pattern. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm meteorologist Don Paul. This is my podcast, Bits o' Blather, on weather, climate, and from time to time, some humor. And so far, the strong El Nino has been one of the dominant variables in how our weather lines up across the lower 48. The southern branch of the jet stream has been more active, producing more precipitation from California across the southern states, but the polar jet stream has been staying for the most part farther north than is typical. And that's partly due to this strong El Nino. It also has produced impacts like below average snowfall in large parts of central and western Canada east of the Canadian Rockies, and an absence of much snow on the ground in the lower 48 in the northern plains as well. It is harder to get a polar air mass generated when snow cover is lacking. And there are some signs that things are going to begin to come together. There's something esoteric I've mentioned in past episodes. Heaven forbid I'm going to bring it up again now. An SSW, a sudden stratospheric warming, is beginning to take shape that's way up in the atmosphere above the part we live in. Not we don't live in the stratosphere, we live in the troposphere, and that's where most of the weather actually occurs. And when a warming develops of adequate strength in the stratosphere at high latitudes, it can help to disrupt the polar vortex, which has been pretty strong nearly all the time so far this season. A strong polar vortex tends to rotate more rapidly, centered closer to the North Pole, and it keeps the polar air trapped at the polar latitudes. It's when the polar vortex begins to slow down and weaken that it can begin to sag southward toward the mid-latitudes where most of us live. And I would imagine anyone hearing this lives. And it's been stretched polar vortex episodes, which have most often resulted in some very short lived, in many cases, but brutal periods of harsh wintry weather. There is not yet something like that showing in the data because we can only see these episodes typically at most 2 weeks in advance. So the definition of this prediction will become somewhat clearer as we get through the next few days. This is New Year's Day. But in the meantime, there are signs, and Dr. Judah Cohen, one of the really esteemed long range forecasters for winter weather, who dearly loves snow and winter, but does not allow his preference to get him into wish casting. That is, he sticks to the science, which he knows so well, is seeing better signs of a stretched polar vortex developing. And here in the eastern part of the Great Lakes, we're going to see that more notably as we get toward January 11th into the 14th, 15th, and 16th. And that could bring some really cold and unsettled conditions into the Great Lakes. But before we get to that stage, we have a little bit of modest wintry weather heading into the eastern Great Lakes midweek this coming week. Wednesday afternoon into Thursday, we're going to have colder air moving in, not the deep polar air, but getting temperatures back below average. Some scattered snow showers will develop in the eastern Great Lakes, including in western New York, where I am, into Wednesday night and Thursday. And on Thursday, we'll have a northwest to northerly flow, just brisk enough to put a nasty wind chill out there on top of actual temperatures Thursday in the mid to upper 20s. No major accumulations with that event. It's during the weekend when things may become more interesting. The southern branch of the jet stream, which is very energized, and part of the reason for that is the strong El Nino, is going to develop a deepening low pressure system Saturday or Saturday night along the southeast Gulf Coast states that could result in, for example, a severe weather outbreak on the warm side of that low Saturday night in parts of the southeast, including Florida, before it makes a turn up the east coast. And on Sunday, the most pessimistic, if you don't like storms, model is the European model, the ECMWF. You don't have to memorize that. And that model takes this low right up the East Coast, and it then becomes, for a day or so, blocked by a cold ridge of high pressure over eastern Canada, which slows down its northward or eastward movement. In the European model, that would bring some heavy snow into northern New Jersey, the New York area, that could become mixed with other precipitation as warmer Atlantic air flows in on strong easterly winds off the Gulf Stream. But if the European model were to verify, it would produce very heavy snow in the Catskills into the interior of New England, possibly Boston as well. New York and Boston have had zilch snow, and for the last 2 years have had just about zilch snow. So the snow lovers there are really frustrated. But the European model would also bring some moderate snow as far west as western New York. And the earliest hints in that model would be the heavier amounts would be at the higher elevations south of Buffalo. But this would not be lake effect. This would be widespread, what we call synoptic snow. And this low would then slowly burrow to the north northeast and pull the heavier snow out of New York State eventually. The American model, the GFS, is slower with the development of the storm and allows it to escape out into the Atlantic beneath that eastern Canadian high that I mentioned, and that would keep any moderate snow well away from western or even central New York. And the bigger impacts would be less to begin with and would be farther south and east. The Canadian model is somewhere in between and takes the low a little farther east, but it's a storm to keep an eye on. Behind it, we're going to start to see an evolution in the upper atmosphere of that polar vortex when we get toward January 10th at the earliest, maybe 11th through the 14th and 15th, weaken and sag to the south, allowing colder air to get first into the north central, then the south central United States. That could take cold air all the way down well into Texas, and then slowly push eastward through the Midwest and into the Great Lakes and the Northeast. And that would mean, if this all verifies, a much wintrier, at least in terms of temperatures, pattern for the central and eastern U.S. than we've seen so far this winter, beginning toward mid-month and through much of January. So at least as we move toward mid-month and the second half of January, it's going to feel more like we used to remember winter's feeling around here. How much snow goes with that is still an open question. Here in the Buffalo area, Lake Erie is at a record high temperature of 43 degrees. It's never been this warm so far into the cold weather season. The average is 35, so it's 8 above average. A warm lake by itself does not give you lake effect. I notice every time I post on Twitter, no, I won't call it X, that people just come out of the woodwork saying, the lake's that warm, we're doomed if they don't like snow. No, we need very cold to polar air to cross Lake Erie for Buffalo, usually on a west-southwest to southwest flow, to produce the really nasty lake effect snow bands. And it remains to be seen whether the cold air that's coming a little later in the month will be accompanied by a favorable alignment of the winds. We just cannot predict that so far in advance. So the bottom line on this episode of the podcast is it is going to get wintrier, first across the north central United States from eastern Montana to Minnesota, then the central plains, then the southern plains, then into the mid-south and the Midwest, and then into the Great Lakes in the Northeast. A slow progression toward the east-northeast. It is a somewhat higher confidence forecast than we've had so far in this cold weather season for cold weather to be arriving. And I'll keep you updated, not just on the temperatures, but on snow potential as we get closer to any upcoming events. Thanks for listening this far. Again, Happy New Year. If you enjoy the podcast or this episode, I hope you will follow and share. It's on all the major platforms now. As usual, thanks for listening this far.